Today we're going to learn how to make a movie by compositing a bunch of still photos. It's going to be one of the most complicated projects ever done. So there was this movie about a guy who ran across the Grand Canyon. Going into the load file dialog, I'm just loading it to replace the project. I'm going to go and conform the project. This is a 4K movie, and it's not going to play back properly if I try to do this while screen capturing. So I'm going to shrink the project size for purposes of documentation. I'm going to reduce this to 1280 by 720. Everything stays at the original movie settings except for the canvas size. That's going to be shrunk for this tutorial. And I set the aspect ratio to automatic, which is going to assume square pixels. So I'll hit OK there. So now we're just seeing the center portion of this movie. So I got to go here to the camera. And then I've got to hold down Shift and click drag until the entire frame fits. Now I already know 720p is about a third the size of 4K. I'm just going to type it into the Z entry. Another thing that'll help with the tutorial is if we go into preferences, playback, set video output to low quality, and set video driver to X11. That's really the fastest way to play 4K on this. So if we want to look around this movie, basically it's a guy running across the Grand Canyon. This particular movie only showed the first 2.5 miles. The entire Grand Canyon traversal is about 22 miles. And basically the video as it came across was missing one key sequence. So it basically ended on this bridge, this underexposed bridge. And then he just disappeared, and the video just ends. And I thought, wouldn't it be nice if we had some drone footage showing this bridge directly from overhead as he ran across it, and then zoomed out from the drone footage to show exactly how far he had to go. So we can basically transition from this into a satellite view that zooms out and shows how far he has to go. And that'll give more of an impact than the way this movie currently ends. And it'll show you how to do a fairly complicated compositing job. So I'm going to take this last segment here. I'm going to navigate the timeline by using the cursor keys. So if you press the up and down cursor keys, you can zoom in and out of where the cursor is. And left and right. Moves left and right. It's really the fastest way to get around. So here he comes. He's going across the bridge. And then I'll just set a label there. And usually for a context shot like this, we can show you just enough so you get the idea he's been running for a long time. "30 seconds is about where you'll lose the audience. So I'm just going to put 30 seconds of this here. So he's running along. You can see him running along. And then he's disappeared on his way. So I'm going to double click between these two labels here on the time bar, which selects the entire region between the two labels. I'm also going to make sure in settings that we have align cursor on frame set, edit labels, edit effects, keyframes, follow edits. Now we go to edit and we say trim selection, which is going to cut away everything except the segment I selected. So now when we go to the beginning of the timeline, there it is. Another thing that's going to help, let's fit this. I'm going to go ahead and fix the lighting on this. So go to right click on the track, attach effect. We're going to attach a histogram. If we just hit this magnifying glass to configure the histogram, and then we select plot histogram to show the current frame. The histogram is mostly configured properly. I want to get the blacks just so they're as black as can be, and then get as much of the whites, get it as bright as possible before the whites blow out. And then fill in the midtones. Try to get the midtones to come out more. Sometimes it's easier just to type it in. So now the bridge will be properly exposed. Even though the playback's going to be slow, because it's scaling down 4K and it's also screen capturing, you get a rough idea of what it's going to look like. Problem is up here, it's going to be pretty blown out. So I'm thinking for a little extra bit of color correction, this would be a good time to do some keyframing. So we go to our view menu. Now we're going to be doing a lot of keyframe editing today. So I'm going to actually bring up the show overlays window, which is going to show you everything from the view menu in this little clickable window. And the thing about this that's really nice is if you want to show a whole bunch of information on the timeline, most of the time with other programs you'd have to manually click in each one of these individually. In Cinelerra you can just press on one and drag to select them all. If you want to turn them off, click on one and drag to turn them all off. So for now we just want to see plugin automation. Now I've got the histogram configured properly just for the bridge. You can see here the DJI's got it for most of the sequence, and then all of a sudden it starts picking the sky over the foreground and it underexposes the foreground. So I'm going to try and look for roughly the point where the DJI is swapping exposures from the foreground to the sky, which is roughly around here. And then I'm going to go to keyframes, copy the default keyframe to the clipboard. And now, merely by saying paste keyframes, it'll actually transfer the default keyframe into a discrete automation point on the timeline. So basically Cinelerra has this concept of a default keyframe, and it also has a concept of an automation point on the timeline. And when you don't have any automation points, when there are no keys shown here, it's going to use the default keyframe, which is not shown here, but it applies to the entire effect. As soon as you paste the clipboard into an automation point and this key appears, if you just have one key, it's going to apply to the entire effect still. But this is how you can actually change settings at different points in time. So before the bridge, the exposure is correct. and I want to create a new keyframe which has neutral histogram settings and just use the DJI's exposure. So I'm going to go here, I'm going to enable automatic keyframe generation. So every time I tweak the histogram, when this is lit, it's going to create a new automation point on the timeline. I'm just going to say reset the histogram. And there's our new automation point. And now, between these two automation points, the histogram is going to interpolate. We're slowly going from default exposure in this segment to where he gets to the bridge, and here the histogram is adjusting to heavily blown out settings, so everything is properly exposed. It's important to disable the automatic keyframes when you're done with them. Otherwise, every time you tweak something, you'll populate the timeline with unnecessary keyframes. And with that bit of tweaking, we're now ready to start adding in the overhead shot. So what we're going to do is we're going to add still photos to this timeline. That's a good idea to save the project at this point. So I'm just going to call it Canyon 1. So we're going to start with the first photo. Now I just want to make changes to a new video track, so I hit Shift T to create a new video track on top of the timeline. Now we don't want to edit the whole timeline here, we just want to edit this one track. So hold down Shift and click the record icon. And that arms just the new video track. If I hold down Shift and click the record icon again, it arms all the tracks again. It's a very useful trick for when you're dealing with multiple tracks. And while we're at it, similar to the overlay menu, if I click and drag, I can select all the tracks just by dragging. I can arm, I can disarm, or I can arm them all by clicking and dragging, and the same goes for playback. So for now, let's just shift click here to edit this one track. And now I'm going to press O to import the first photo. These 5 photos were screen captured earlier from Google Maps. I'll just load the first photo here, which is going to be the closest one. I'm going to hit paste at insertion point. And just like that, the photo is at our insertion point here. I'm going to hit the down arrow to zoom in on this. When you load a still photo, it only loads it into one frame. So if you want this still photo to play longer than one frame, you've got 2 options. You can select it and then go to edit, and you can say edit length and change this to whatever length you want. Or you can go zoom in again on the timeline. You can go to where the insertion point turns into a right arrow. Left click and drag it out. This is how I do it most of the time. So 5 seconds is probably a good starting point for this. That's about, I'm just going to hold down Shift, click and drag to adjust the highlighted region here and set it around 5 seconds. And then I'll select the end and hit delete to trim it 5 seconds. I'm going to go back to the overlay screen, click and drag to show all the camera automations. And then go to the timeline, and I'm going to go fit the automation. And this shows all of our camera curves. The final step is to enable keyframe generation. The first keyframe will be our starting point here. When it loaded the photo, the pixels were at a 1:1 ratio. There was no zooming, so I'm just going to leave this where it is. We want to create keyframes for X, Y, and Z here, so I'll just go here. I'll just tweak these tumbler buttons. And there we can see our keyframes have been generated on the timeline. And then I'm going to go to the end of this. Do one frame before the end. Hold down Shift, click and drag in the compositor. And this is how we're going to zoom out. So here you can see the browser window borders. I want to stop zooming out right before those window borders show up. And fit the automation again. So here's how our first zoom sequence is going to go. Nice and slow. So that's basically the limit of the first photograph. Now we have to load a second photograph. Most of the time, you're going to be using multiple photos for different zoom levels. So to import the next photo, I'm just going to do, instead of Shift T this time, I'm going to go to the right click on this, add track. And I'm going to begin the next photo one frame before the last photo ends. And then I'm going to do a Shift click to arm just the one track. I'm going to load the next file here in paste mode. And the next photo has replaced the previous photo in our compositor. So let's zoom in using the cursor keys. Let's drag it out. Let's just say 5 seconds again, or roughly 5 seconds. The trick is you want to align these two photos where they overlap. And to do that, I want to reduce the alpha of the new photo so we can see both of them at the same time. The problem is right now if I do this, it just fades to black. And that's because if we go into settings format, we don't have an alpha channel in our color space. We have to select YUVA or RGBA, but I'm going to use YUVA to retain more of the color information. And now that the alpha channel is enabled, you can see both photos roughly at the same time here. So you want to get these, so you have an idea of where the bridge is in both photos. You can see the bridge here and here. Enable keyframe generation. Again, I'm just going to click and drag here to line up the bridges. And let's zoom in here. And you can sort of probably easier to do the Z first. Get the two bridges the same, similar sizes, and then move the X and the Y here. And they're roughly aligned. So now we go to the timeline, fit the automation again. Let's turn this back to 100%. And go to the end of our new photo and zoom the spec out to automatic. So what I'm doing here is zooming the compositor window. If you select automatic, it'll just fit the frame to whatever size the compositor window is. If you select a percentage, it'll zoom in independently of the compositor window size. And it'll give you some scroll bars. You can also move around by middle clicking and dragging in the compositor window. And in addition to this menu, you can right click here and zoom auto. So if we play back, starting with the first photo and going into the second photo, see, here's the first one. And right now we don't have any automation here, so I'm going to go one frame before the end of the second one, zoom out as far as it'll go before you see the browser window. Let's get that centered there. So now when we play this back, zooming out, here's the second photo. Now, as you can see, the zoom is getting a little too fast here. It's nice and slow here, and then all of a sudden, it's really fast here. So this can get complicated. For starters, I'm just going to extend the length of the edit here. For a still photo, just highlight the amount of time you want to add. Click and drag, and then hold down Shift and hit space. So I'm going to add 4 seconds roughly. So now we've pasted silence into the middle of this thing. Now I'm going to do a middle click here, and then drag to the end. So that's going to fill in the silence with more of the still photo. So when we play this back now, what once took 5 seconds will now take 10 seconds. And you can see that slowly zooming out. There are other things we can do to smooth out the motion even more, but for now I'm just going to leave it at lengthening the edit here. So we'll just quickly add the last of the photos. So now that all the edits are in place, I want to adjust the soundtrack a little. I'm just going to go ahead and press D twice to delete the old soundtrack entirely. Disable keyframes so we don't automatically generate any. And then I'm going to create 2 more tracks. Just arm the 2 new tracks and hit paste in the resource window. So we just get the soundtrack. There was a really good song in about 15 minutes. They never gave credit to the song, so we only have the audio in this movie. So it starts around here. I'm going to hold Shift, press the rewind, and then hit delete. So we just have that one song, and then I'm going to go to the end of this. Hold down Shift and jump to the end, and then hit delete. So we just have enough of it to fill in our timeline. If you want to play it back at normal speed, the best thing to do is to render it. This is a good time to show an example of rendering. So I'm going to go into settings, preferences. I'm going to set it to high quality again. Now we go to file, render. It's just going to be called Canyon. The preferred format for rendering video is QuickTime for audio, MPEG-4, a bitrate of 192 kilobits or higher. For video, H.264, quantization 30 and below is almost going to be lossless. 30 and above is going to start reducing the quality. Fixed quantization, hit the OK button.